Here's a shop apprentice's first time playing in snow. My wife was able to get him all dressed up in his ski boots and stuff, and he was having a blast. This is a scoring blade, and it's a small saw blade that spins in the opposite direction of the main saw blade, and it helps prevent chip out when you're cutting melamine and other various types of plywood. So during the course of this video, I'll be making a couple of cabinets to go on either side of a fireplace, and a mantel shelf to go above the fireplace. Here's a rendering of what the finished product will look like. The mantel will look a little different, it'll be painted white, and the crown molding buildup will be a little bit different, but for the most part that's what it will look like when it's done. So I get started in the usual way of breaking down sheet goods into cabinet parts, and a sliding table saw makes for quick and accurate work of this. If you look at the top portion of the picture here, you'll see an entire ash tree cut up into chunks, and that was given to me by a buddy, and I hope to process that into bowls and other things in the coming months, so stay tuned for that. Here we have the left and right sides of the lowers, and I like to mark the bottoms. And I do this so when I drill shelf pin holes, or any other hardware holes, I always reference them off the bottom. Here I'm using my MEG Products shelf pin hole jig. This thing works awesome, and I'm using a 5mm plunge bit. Now that the shelf pin holes are drilled, it's time to move on to the holes for the drawer slides. And for this process, I turn to one of the newer additions to my shop, and that's the Mafel Duo Dowler, or as I like to call it, the Duo Dowler. And I'm using it along with its track in I guess a front to back orientation, where I'm referencing off the front side of the panel. And you'll see all this come together here in just a second. In this shot, you're looking at the left and right sides, and then a center partition that's designed just to carry the drawer slides. And here's the payoff for taking a little bit of extra time to drill these hardware holes. The result is a very accurately placed drawer slide. One final machining operation for the lowers before I put them together, and that is adding some pocket holes. And this is my method for attaching the face frames to the cabinets. I use staples and screws to put my cabinets together, and the staples are really there just to hold everything in place until I have an opportunity to come back and add some screws. And here I'm adding the partition that's going to separate the two drawers. When screwing cabinets together, or when screwing any 3/4 inch plywood or particle board or MDF, I think a proper countersinker is critical. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I use coming up here in this video. Here I'm laminating two pieces of 3/4 inch MDF together, and this will end up becoming, I guess, a countertop, but it will be the bottom of the upper cabinet. And you'll see how this comes together in just a couple minutes. Yeah, I don't know, was this too many clamps, or was this just the right amount of clamps? You tell me. So now it's time to collect some lumber and move on to making some face frames. Most of the time I buy rough cut lumber, and that's what I have here. And if you don't know what that means, basically the lumber has been cut into boards at the sawmill and no additional milling has been done to it. And buying rough lumber to me has two main benefits. One, it's significantly cheaper, and two, it affords me the opportunity to do my own milling, which I do a real nice accurate job, so my parts come out more square, and I think that's really worth the effort that it takes to mill up lumber. So as I mentioned earlier, this is Poplar, and the place that I buy lumber from gives you a really good price break if you buy 100 feet of a particular lumber at a time. So since everybody wants white paint grade these days, I just buy 100 feet bulk packs, and they give me a real good price. My method for processing rough cut lumber goes like this. I pick out the boards that I think will work. I take them to the chop saw where they are cut to rough length. Then I go and bounce between the bandsaw and the joiner where I cut to rough width. From there I do a final jointing and then I plane. And after that I rip to final width and then I cut to final length as I'm doing here. A lot of my cabinetry projects do have very tall or very wide cabinets, and I set up my chop saw station where I can cut to length a full 8-foot piece to the right of the blade. That's been real convenient. At this point, all of the pieces to make up the face frames have been cut to length, ripped to width, and planed to thickness. And here I'm just going to dress the inside edges of everything. It's easier to do it while they're pieces than it is after they're all put together. This sanding disc is known as the Edge Tech, and if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that, I have a video going into great detail on my channel, and it's called MDF Edge End Grain Prep. So I hold together my face frames with pocket screws and glue. When building face frames, I like to carefully apply glue. And I apply very little glue to that inside corner there so it doesn't squeeze out to the inside edge of the face frame. That helps with cleanup later. And I like to clamp the components to the overhang on my bench. And I just use a standard Craig clamp and 1.25" pocket screws. Very simple but very effective. If I were a betting man, I would be willing to bet that there were thousands of cabinet shops across the globe that build their face frames this exact same way every single day. I like to use spacers when I'm positioning face frame components. I don't know that it's more accurate than making marks and working to those marks, but I think it's a little more consistent. For those of you who don't know, this is called a wide belt sander, and it works a lot like a planer, except it uses sandpaper to do the cutting instead of a blade. And one of the main benefits of using sandpaper versus a blade is that you can cut cross grain. So for sanding doors or face frames, this is really the tool of choice. One of the other neat features of this sander is it has what's called a platen. And a platen is like a 2.5-inch wide piece of graphite that runs the width of the machine, and it presses the sandpaper down gently on the surface, so you get a very, very clean, nicely sanded surface right off the sander. It requires very little touch-up with a hand sander. Everybody who lives in Denver thinks that they live on the windy side of town. Well, here's some proof that we actually do live on the windy side of town. So those two pieces of 3/4-inch MDF that I laminated together, they are now dry, and I'm just cleaning them up. Cut them to width and a quick sanding, and they're ready to go. Here's the countersink that I use. It's set to drill to a depth of 1 3/4, and it has a taper to it. And I use 1 3/4 screws that have what's called a combination drive, and you can either use a Phillips or a No. 2 square drive. And this is a shot of the driver that I use. It's just a Craig No. 2 square drive. And to make sure that the shelves align with the face frame members, I use the mighty biscuit joiner. And this may seem a little odd that I'm attaching the face frame without the shelves installed, but you'll see how this all comes together in a couple minutes, and I think it's quite brilliant if I do say so myself. Here's how I do it. I glue and clamp the shelf to the face frame before attaching the shelf to the cabinet side. And doing it this way ensures that the joint between the shelf and the face frame is nice and tight and nice and even. And once everything's clamped in place, I come back with a square and I put that on the shelf just to make sure that it's square to the cabinet. And then I come back and add a couple of screws. So I'm adding what's referred to in the industry as a nailer. And this is the cabinet member that I screw through into the wall and then into a stud to assure that the cabinet's attached to the wall. So I always attach the backs with staples and screws. I've had this staple gun for probably 20 years now, and I don't know how many tens of thousands of staples I've shot through this thing, and it's never given me one little bit of trouble. This is known as a flush trim V-groove router bit. Now, no matter how much effort you put into attaching the shelf to the face frame, there's still a chance that that seam can open up over the years. So you just add this little V-groove and it creates a nice little shadow line. I also like to add a small round over to the inside edges of everything. I think it softens the feel of it, makes it look a little bit more elegant, and helps prevent denting. Here I'm just making one adjustable shelf for each of the lower cabinets. This is the support structure that the cabinets will sit on, also known as a toe kick. Here I'm drilling the two 5mm holes needed for the hinge plates, and they're set 37mm back from the front edge of the cabinet, and they're spaced 32mm apart. As I mentioned earlier, I attach the face frames to the cabinets with pocket screws, and I just use a couple clamps and work my way around the perimeter. And intentionally I use no glue in this process because once in a while I like to take the face frames off of the cabinets for finishing. I also like to use a real small drill driver for this process, and that helps to not over torque the screws. Alright, now it's time to add some hardware. Hinge plates and drawer slides. The hardware I'm installing is made by Bloom. I'm installing 0mm hinge plates here, and those are used in conjunction with a full crank hinge, and that gives you about a 1/8 inch gap all the way around the door when doing a flush inset door. Here's a good close-up of the 5mm holes that I drilled, and they are designed to be used with what's called system screws, which are perfectly mated to 5mm holes. These are Bloom tandem drawer slides, and they have a soft close feature. One of the neat things about these slides is that they're undermount, and what that means is that when the drawer is pulled out, you don't see the drawer slide at all. It's all underneath the drawer box. Now that all the hardware is installed, it's time to turn our attention to making some drawer boxes, and I start by ripping out strips of 1/2 inch pre-finished plywood. In typical male fashion, I do absolutely everything in my power to avoid reading instructions. However, when building drawer boxes for these particular types of drawer slides, I do recommend you open the book and give it a read. And what you learn when reading the instruction manual is how to calculate the widths of the front and back of the drawer box based on the width of the opening of the cabinet. This is an 80-tooth high ATB saw blade that I use for plywood. This is a 1/4 inch flat top grooving saw blade that I use to cut the grooves to accept the bottoms of the drawer boxes. Here's that 1/4 inch groover in action, and that groove is spaced precisely 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the drawer box. So because these drawer slides are undermount, you have to do some clearancing on the rear of the drawer box, and this is the area where the drawer slide kind of slides in and out of, if that makes sense. When building production-style drawer boxes, I like to use dowels. And here I'm using a 5mm dowel that's 16mm in length. It makes for a real strong drawer box. And I didn't show it on camera, but I actually drilled all these parts twice, so there was a total of 3 dowel holes and not just 2. I'm not quite sure what it is, but there's something oddly satisfying about the dowel joint. And for plywood drawer boxes that aren't going to be put under a bunch of stress, the dowel joint really is a good solution. So when I was slapping these drawer boxes together, an old song came on the radio that I hadn't heard in a while that I really like, and it's by Dire Straits, and the name of the song is Tunnel of Love. And if you haven't heard that one before, I suggest you give it a listen. It's an absolutely fantastic song, and wait till the end. There's a really good guitar solo at the end of that song. And if you heard the band name Dire Straits and thought of the song Money for Nothing, this song sounds nothing like that song. Here's the final machining process for the drawer boxes. The Bloom Tandem drawer slides require some accurately placed hardware, so this jig that they sell allows you to do that pretty easily. So this hole accepts a pin that's on the back of the drawer slide, and this prevents the drawer box from rocking forward off of the drawer slide when it's fully extended. These clips are what attach the drawer box to the drawer slide, and one neat feature is the orange levers that you see there allow you to take the drawer box on and off the slide very quickly. Here's a nice close-up of how these clips bite onto the drawer slide. And this little wheel allows you to adjust the drawer box from left to right in the opening. This feature tremendously helps hack cabinet makers like myself. So once the drawer boxes are all built, I sand the top edges, and I also like to knock off all the sharp corners with a sanding block. And the final step is I add a coat of shellac to the top edge. Here's a nice shot of how clean the installation is with the undermount drawer slide. Also, the soft close is cool. Next, it was time to turn my attention to making the door and drawer fronts. After making all of the necessary and highly complex calculations, I milled up some more lumber. Alright, listen to the clanging in this shot. Can you guess what that noise was? The bolt holding the drive belt pulley on had backed out, and consequently the drive belt pulley had become loose and was clanging around. Another couple minutes running it, and that could have really turned into disaster. My router table is a real cobbled together mess of about 3 different router tables I've built over the years. And hopefully in the not too distant future I'll have some time to rebuild this router table properly. I actually have a big pile of parts I've been collecting over the last year or so, and I hope to put it all together into the ultimate router table build. And I'll probably name the video The More Ultimate Than Your Ultimate Router Table Build. Hopefully that makes sense. By adding glue to the bottom of the 4 grooves as well as the end grain of the rails, this door becomes very, very strong. I fill the voids left by the router table groover with small offcuts of 1/4 inch thick MDF, and you'll see how I cut those off in the next shot. I got my starting sequence from the movie Mad Max Fury Road. After I take the doors out of the clamps, I clean up all 4 edges on the sliding table saw, and I cut all the parts slightly oversized, maybe a 32nd, and you'll see why I do that later. And then I head over to perhaps my most favorite tool in the shop, the wide belt sander, and everything gets run through on each side one time. Next I drill the doors for the hinges. These are Bloom Inserta hinges, and they clip into the door and onto the cabinet very quickly. And they also come off very quickly, which is nice when you're breaking down for finishing. And they have a soft close feature that's adjustable that's built right into the hinge itself. Here I'm adding a shim so the flat panel won't be distorted when I install the drawer pole. So here's the reason I cut the door and drawer front slightly oversized at the sliding table saw. I actually use sanding as my method to do the final fitment. This machine is known as an edge sander, and I absolutely love it. I really didn't know why anyone would need an edge sander until I bought one, and now that I have it, I really don't know how I lived without it. Here's one of the byproducts of getting older. You need more light to see, so I decided to add this clip-on light to my sanding station, and it's really helped. I built this sanding station a couple of years ago, and I sized the top of it to the size of a floor mat. And the floor mat actually works great for sanding on. It doesn't mark or scuff the workpiece at all, but it has a little bit of grip and helps hold it in place. If you've ever tried to mount separate drawer fronts to drawer boxes in a cabinet, you know that that can be a little bit frustrating, and this is my process for making a nice, predictable, adjustable way to install drawer fronts. And you start by drilling two 20mm holes in the back side of the drawer front. And the next step is you use these center punches to mark the locations on the drawer boxes where you need to drill. And this is rough. There's a little bit of flexibility in this. You just kind of get it as close as you can. Next, you drill holes in the two dimples that you've created. I like to use a little backer so there's very little blowout on the inside edge of the drawer box. These suckers here are really the key to the whole system. They friction fit into the 20mm hole that you just drilled, but in the center of them there's a floating steel plate that allows the drawer front to move up and down and left and right during installation. And if you want some more information about these drawer box adjusters, you can just do a web search for Bloom drawer box adjuster, and all the necessary parts will pop up. And also the Bloom part number is 295.1000. And the key to using these drawer box adjusters is to screw the drawer fronts on lightly, then kind of shimmy it around until it's in the exact right place, then go ahead and tighten everything up. Our little baby has somehow magically transformed into a little boy. Where does the time go? Alright, so at this point the cabinets are complete, and now it's time to turn my attention to building the fireplace mantel. And this is just going to be a very simple shelf. I'm going to wrap it in a little bit of molding and then paint it white to match the cabinets. Clamping up miters can always be tricky, and I deal with this in two ways. I like to reinforce the joint with either biscuits or dowels or dominoes, and then I created a couple little clamping squares that you can see here. I just made them out of plywood. And these help ensure that your glue up is a true 90 degrees when it's all said and done. Next I cut out the top and bottom, which are conveniently both the same size. Now that this center section is dry, I'm able to cut some biscuit slots and join the top and bottom to this piece. Biscuits and glue are two of my most favorite woodworking ingredients. Not to be confused with biscuits and gravy, which are two of my most favorite breakfast ingredients. Alright, now it's time to add a little bit of molding, and then this thing will be ready for primer. Alright, I'm going to reach out to the audience here. I'm officially in the market for a new 23 gauge pin nail gun, and I would be very interested to hear your input as to what you have and do you like it and should I buy one. So I've had this Grex 23 gauge pin nailer for a very long time, and it has shot thousands and thousands of nails. And I've rebuilt it a few times, and I'm kind of getting tired of it. And I think it's about time for a new nail gun. And I would be very interested to hear who's had positive results and with what nail gun. Let me know in the comments section below. Quick pro tip here, these are Collins miter clamps, and they will take your miter joints from average to awesome. So when possible, I like to leave moldings long on one side and just focus on the miter joint, and then come back and trim it up later as I'm doing here. Coming down to the final details here, I'm just making some base molding. This is one of the main reasons I want to rebuild my router table. I want to add a power feeder, and the reason is when you make moldings, nothing makes your moldings better than having a real good consistent feed rate. Another quick pro tip, make one rough pass, then slightly raise the router a bit, like a 32nd of an inch, and make a final pass. So here I'm ripping a 15-degree angle into this board, and I will use these two pieces as a French cleat to mount the mantle to the wall. I always thought spring clamps were sort of a silly little toy of a tool, until I bought a whole bunch of them, and now I don't know how I lived without them. So here I'm just adding a couple of shims to the bottom of my French cleat so that it fills the entire void of the fireplace mantle. Here I'm just adding a little clearance to the cleat so that it can slide in and out without binding. So when I hang this mantle on the wall, I'll actually just put 3 screws in through the bottom into those shims that I attached. Now that all the building is done, it's time for some finish sanding, and then on to primer. So here's my sequence for spraying doors. I hit all the edges first, and then I spray the back. I let it dry, then I flip it over, I spray all the edges again, and then I spray the front. After primer, it's time to paint. So I've been slowly switching over to these Binks spray gun, and that's B-I-N-K-S, and I use the model 2001. What's nice about these guns is they can run at a little bit higher pressure, which is perfect for the water-based coatings that I like to spray. And one of the other great things is they're a reputable company who's been around for a long time, so it's very easy to get rebuild parts. And if you've owned a spray gun for any length of time, you know that they need constant attention. I let the paint dry for a few days, then it was time to install. Here's a shot of the stone that's going to be applied around the fireplace and above the fireplace mantle all the way to the ceiling. Here are a couple close-ups. Nice even gaps around all the doors and drawers. The paint just came out real nice, just beautifully smooth. Part of that is spraying it, and then also part of it is that it's a high-quality paint. Sherwin-Williams Pro Classic. A couple days after I was done installing, the stone guy was going to come back and put the stone up, and also an electrician was going to come in and install some lights in the top of the cabinets. You can't see it here, but there's an outlet as well as a cable outlet, and at some point they're going to put some AV equipment in here. And the final piece to this project is the customer's going to have the entire house painted. You know, it's kind of weird doing this for a living. I spend a great deal of time and effort building these projects. Then I deliver them, install them, and walk away. And oftentimes I don't even get to see the finished product because there are other contractors to come in after me. And just like that, the project's over. And oftentimes when a project is over, I sort of walk around my shop for 20 or 30 minutes kind of wondering, well, what do I do now? And usually my solution is just to organize my tools and clean up a little bit. And after that, it's time to move on to the next one. So with that said, thanks for watching. Until next time.